all that good stuff. Get comfortable.
Yes.
Welcome.
Anyway,
We're glad you're here on this
this should be
snowy,
another
icy,
program
slippery day.
I've never been able to find it.
Okay.
I came early this morning. It was just starting to snow, so I avoided most of the mess. Good on chairs. I think we got plenty for now. Got a few more from you. Okay. We've been rolling through all kinds of stuff here. I don't know if you've been able to see it. I'm going to dim these a little bit. Might help.
Much better. Much better.
Okay. First off, do we have any newly licensed hams today? Recently newly licensed hams? We have two. Stand and tell us about yourself, please.
Mark Berger, live in Far West.
Cool. What's your call sign?
U07 Yankee Alpha Charlie.
Yankee Alpha Charlie. Everybody be listening for Yankee Alpha Charlie. We know each other by call signs better than our faces or our names.
My name's Scott, AI7UK.
AI7UK? You've been around a little while then.
Uh-huh.
Did you just move in the area or are you just joining us?
No, I've lived in this area. So.
Okay. Well, welcome. We're glad you're with us today.
I'm Hayden Mann. I've been licensed for about 5 years. I'm newer to the area, so I thought I'd join.
Perfect.
I'm Kilo Juliet 7 Oscar Alpha Victory.
Oscar Alpha Victor. Okay. You licensed just before me because I'm Victor Romeo Mike. Then I dropped a KJ and added a W0.
Why, we don't know.
It's a long story we don't have time for at the moment, so here we go. Do we have any license upgrades since our last gathering? Okay. Is Colleen here today? I don't see her. Okay. Well, for the last several months I've wanted to embarrass her in front of all of you, but maybe that's why she's staying away. Next week, we will be doing our winter field day out at the farm. For those who don't know where the farm is, all that information's on our website with an address and everything. It's off 12th Street in West Weaver. And we'll be inside of a heated shed, which is decently sized. So we'll be setting up about 10 o'clock and starting to operate about noon. We'll go from noon to 5. And then we are going to have a delicious dinner. And Zoe, our activities director, is planning things that you can't even imagine. You'll want to come.
You'll get a hot meal and stuff to snack on during the day. So
You're going to get good stuff all day long. So
yeah.
Come join us.
If you're on keto maggots for the day.
Just an update on our technician class that we've been holding this month. Last Wednesday night was our second night. Each night, we have had 21 people in that classroom up at Weaver State. Plus, we've had 3 to 5 online with Zoom, both nights. And we are pretty excited about that. I told Rick, he said, well, I put 20 slots in for the exam. I said, you might want to up that a little bit. And so we'll see how it goes by the end when we're helping them get registered. But it's pretty cool. First week in February, if you're thinking of doing an upgrade and you need an exam, we'll be doing one here on the 5th of February in the library where we always have them. Every February, June, and October, we have an exam session here, which is one of the reasons we're doing classes, so we have a reason to come and to take exams. Anyway, April and May, Wednesday nights, we're planning to do a general class. So anybody who's looking to upgrade to a general, we'll probably do it up at Weaver State again, same place, same bat time, Wednesday nights. We'll take 2 months to do it, so we don't have to move so fast. And then the exam session on the 4th of June will be for all those folks. Last year, we got 10 new generals out of that class. We were pretty excited about that, and we appreciate everybody who's been helping us. There will be yet another technician class in September. And I have cleared my calendar on Wednesday night, so when these regular classes aren't happening, if you know people or have a group that wants to do a class, I am happy to do additional classes for them. People ask me all the time, when's the next course? When's the next course? How can I get involved in ham radio? Let them know we're willing to help them. For those who are interested in our board meetings, and our board meets because we eat, usually at Ramblin' Roads. We're going to plan one on February 12th, which is the second Wednesday night in February. We'll probably meet there about 6 o'clock, and we'll order, and then we'll talk about things after that. One of the reasons for that is the board, over the last 2 or 3 meetings, has been considering some changes to bylaws. On our website, Val has posted the proposed changes. We recommend that all of you take a look. And if you have suggestions, concerns, questions, whatever, email one of the members of the board. You can email me, call me, whatever. So we have some idea what you're thinking about as far as the bylaw changes.
What time is the board meeting?
Yeah.
6.
Okay.
Time? 6.
6.
Got it.
Okay. Mike has been helping us with our antenna stuff, and this next week when we set up for our field day, he will be here to help us figure out what we normally have done, what equipment we use, we get it out of our storage area, and he will be helping us, teaching us how to set it up properly next week, 10 o'clock. I encourage as many folks to come as would like to help us. Why is that, Mike? He's leaving.
So you need to show up and figure out how we set it all up. We set up the vertical antenna for this one, just outside the shack, or the building with the shed, whatever it's called. And so we need a bunch of people who can learn how to do it, and some people who can learn how to set up the radio and get the computer working with and everything, and get everything functional. And so show up and volunteer to help out in some fashion. We'll be out there around 10 o'clock. You can say the address is on the website. It's easy to find. So just follow the instructions on the website, and you shouldn't have any problems finding it. Between that and your phone with the address, you shouldn't have any issues finding the place.
So please come help us. This is the last time for a year or so that Mike will be available. And this summer when we have our field day, it might be good to have had a little practice and know what we're doing. Just saying. Now, most of you know that I am probably one of the least experienced hams here. I was licensed in 2021, whereas Evan was licensed in 1949. And we have people everywhere in between, right? So those of you with more experience, please come. Please help us. We enjoy the help. And with that, we've got Brother Rick Mead again. We just can't get enough of Rick.
I know.
So he's going to talk to us, and please give him your attention. Let's make sure I got you on there.
There we go.
Back in 1966, when I first became licensed as a ham and got my novice license, and once I got the paper in the mail, I was able to sit down with my Heathkit DX68 and HR10 receiver and start working on Morse code. The only crystals I had were 40 meters. I was actually licensed at the peak of sunspot cycle 20. And so 40 meters was not necessarily the best one at that time to get across the country. But one of the things that I noticed early on was I started making contacts on CW. California was always easy to hit. I mean, they were there no matter what was going on. But during the night, especially Saturday night, I'd be down in my shack, in my dad's basement, my mom and dad's basement. And as the night wore on, I started hearing different numbers on the call signs. And it was the 9s and 0s and then 5s and 4s and 2s and 1s. And by about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I was able to work the East Coast as a novice at 75 watts. And then when the sun came up, I couldn't. That, at that time, was what got me studying about propagation. And that's how this began. And so my intention here today is to not make you experts in propagation. That would take months. But what I want to do is whet your appetite so you'll start doing some of your own research on propagation and understand a little bit more about it and provide some framework for it. So with that, my name is Rick Mead. W7VQ is my call sign. I'm still the ARL Utah Assistant Section Manager. I'm an NTS official relay station and a digital relay station. Now, I told Rich Fisher when I came up here I was going to reference him at this point because my digital node has been down for an extended period of time, and I'm still waiting for him to fire me because I've got to get that back up because I'm not able to run stuff through there. But he refuses to do that because we haven't got that many digital nodes in the state of Utah. So at any rate, one of the things I want to acknowledge here, this presentation, I have modified. A good bunch of this came from this guy, Jerry DeFucht, 80A. And I am a big fan of it. If it's round and rolls, I don't want to reinvent a wheel. I'll use somebody else's wheel and just tell them thank you for letting me use it. So that's what we're going to be going through today. Okay, so what I'm going to cover. And normally if I was doing a presentation, I would want to go through these things sort of in order. But with propagation, they will blend together in lots of different ways. So we're going to be talking about ground waves. We're going to be talking about antenna radiation patterns, and the reason we're going to talk about that is because that has an effect on how far your skip is going to go, and because what it's talking about is the angle at which the main node from your antenna leaves the antenna and goes forward. And then we're going to be talking about skywave propagation, and we're going to be talking about the sun. As everybody knows, the sun is a big part of this. Has anybody heard of the Carrington event? Very good. That happened back in, and I'm going to put a link down here at the bottom of this thing, and I would encourage you to go look at it. It happened in 1859. It was, matter of fact, it was in September of that year. It was actually a coronal mass projection that was observed by Carrington, who was an astronomer in England. And 2 days later, it took out so much electronics, which back in that day was telegraph, but it broke a lot of things on the Earth, and it was the largest coronal mass ejection that has been recorded. And if we had one of those like that today, it would be problematic for us, for everything that we've got going on. But the sun has a big impact on what it is we do. So ground waves. This I picked up from this young man here. John Berry was the author of this. He's actually got a very good long paper on ground waves and how they work. And if you want to really get into the details of it, look him up and ground waves, and you'll find his paper. It's quite good. But basically, ground wave is complex. The ground waves is actually made up of 3 different waves. One is the direct line of sight, one is reflected from the Earth back up, and then the other is surface waves. And surface waves are the ones that allow ground waves to travel further than the horizon, the visible horizon. So if you look at, you can calculate what the electronic horizon is using some formulas, and if you're interested in that, this paper will tell you about this. But the electronic, for surface waves, the electronic horizon is beyond your visible horizon. So that's what lets you get further distance with ground waves than just line of sight as you go through with that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about more of that in just a second. So it tends to be relevant from this time, from 10 kilohertz to 30, and it can get up to tens of kilometers distance away from you, which is over the visible horizon. That's used a lot for nets. It's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, a lot of the nets that are for traffic are on 80 meters. I mean, that TWN and a lot of the other ones run there because for short distance communications, ground waves can be more effective. However, there's a caveat to that, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute. Come on. Don't do that to me, little thing here. Okay. This chart is showing ground waves, and this specifically was created for 30 megahertz, and this is the transmission loss in dBs over a distance going out to 1,000 kilometers. What you'll notice here, there's three sections here. One is land, one is marshy areas, and the other is sea. You'll notice over salty water, that's where you've got the least loss of signal strength for ground waves. This comes into play, especially at the lower frequencies, and is one of the reasons why Marconi was successful in getting signals across the Atlantic and from ship to shore. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second as well. So, the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about antenna radiation patterns. Has anybody looked at these before? And good. I'm glad to see somebody has been doing this. But this is a vertical. And I know that some people, I know one of the hams in the Davis Club, specifically Gary N7DMD, likes to say that vertical antennas radiate equally poorly in all directions, and which is for skywave is true, but for ground waves it is the most effective antenna, because the other thing, and I've got a slide on this in a minute, vertical polarized signals travel better on ground waves and surface waves than horizontally polarized. You get much more light, much more signal loss with horizontal polarization for ground waves. Works really well for sky waves, but there's a difference in them. And we'll have some further conversations about that as we go through this. Next antenna I've got here is a dipole. That one goes out to either side. Next one I did was an end-fed, and I showed this one in particular because when I go out in the field, I take an end-fed with me. I love end-fed antennas for setting up outside. And that's what I'm going to be running out of the island this next weekend for winter field day from my trailer. But what's interesting about an end-fed, when you look at the radiation patterns, my end-fed is cut for 80 meters, and on 80 meters, it's got a single node loop that you can see that is propagating out. If you go down to other frequencies, getting all the way down to the shortest frequencies, 10 meters, which is what this one is showing, you can see that there are multiple nodes that are coming out of this thing, and it provides a pretty broad coverage of signals going up to reflect off the ionosphere, or actually crack off the atmosphere. So it's an interesting antenna to look at, and it's got a lot of interesting operating capabilities. This is a Yagi. I have a Yagi at my house too, sitting up on my roof. And what this one is showing is a couple of things. And this chart shows a comparison to a dipole. But on the Aggie, first of all, it's directional. So you've got this large node going outbound from it. And then the takeoff angle is quite low. And this is a takeoff angle on a Yagi of 60 feet, approximately. Mine's not that high, so my takeoff angle is a little steeper than that. But it's a good antenna for operation. HMS Titanic. Who has looked at these antennas just because they're curious about them? This is the antenna. This is a line going up to the top. And then you see all of these lines going stem to stern on that ship. And that's the antenna that was put, it's called a T antenna, that was put on, that Marconi used. This is the one that he perfected as he was building his first smart gap distance communication, running CW and so forth. But can anybody tell me what the properties are of this antenna? Let me ask this question. Is it a vertically or a horizontally polarized antenna? Horizontal? No, it's vertical. The thing that's interesting about this is that this is actually the element where the emissions come out, and this is a gargantuan capacitance hat at the top of it in order to balance it. And it's a vertical antenna, which made it really good for communication from ship to shore over what medium? Seawater. And so you've got an excellent ground wave or surface wave antenna there in order to run that. Does anybody know what frequencies Marconi used to use for this?
500?
That's very good. That's exactly right. 500 kilohertz. And so he was down actually right below our AM bands. I think actually the Titanic was 272. A lot of them were 300. But it was in that area that those smart apps actually operated. And so who remembers driving around? Well, I can read this. Who remembers driving around their car in the late 1960s and then in the middle of the night when you were supposed to be home but you were late and you started hearing AM stations coming in from way far away? Ground wave. And that's changing because of the night changing the surface medium that was causing that ground wave or the surface wave to extend further. So that's the dynamics that are in play here. Yes, sir?
I think the low-frequency beacon at the Brigham City Airport used this kind of an antenna for airplanes coming over. The same hat.
Yep.
It's not working now, but I think I remember the antenna.
That's a great point, and yes, they do for those low-frequency beacons and so forth. That's exactly right. And so all of the Marconi antennas looked at this, and if you take a look at this guy here, the feed line's going up there. There's actually 4 of them that run up to each one of those 4 that are going across here. This is an interesting antenna to do a little bit of reading and research about because it's getting that balanced and putting that up is an interesting thing to explore. So that's why this thing works so well, because it's a vertical antenna going across the ocean, and that propagation. Some of it could be skywave, but most of it was really surface wave that allowed that signal to get where it was destined.
Question: you mentioned on AM radio at night, we listen to it like you said from a long ways away. You said that it was the propagation was the ground wave that was changed.
Yeah.
I had always thought that it, again, was the ionosphere or something. Can you speak a little bit?
Yeah, what we're talking about in a minute is that the thing that changes the way a radio wave propagates is the medium. It will refract as it goes through mediums of different masses and temperatures. So one of the things that happens at night is that the air temperature starts to cool, the ground is warm, and so it creates a layer that allows the refraction of that radio signal. And that's where, and for AM radios especially, because you're down in the medium frequency range for that. And medium frequency is not something that is used as for skywaves. That's got to be either ground wave or line of sight. That's where that comes from. But it's where that temperature changes, and you've got mediums of different temperatures and also different moisture content Because the two things that will affect that is both the continuity, so how it passes electrical fields, and also the permeability of the surface that it's traveling over or through, because that affects the permeability is dealing with the impact on magnetic flux and so forth, rather than the electronics of it. And so as that goes through there, that will cause it to bend. Okay? And so that's where that comes from. Any other questions about this so far? Yes, sir?
When you listen to KSL and KNX, when you're traveling away from Salt Lake, you hear it, and then all of a sudden you hear a whoosh, where the sky wave is catching up with the ground wave, or vice versa.
Yeah, it can be a couple of things, because if you go back to that first slide we were talking about, there's three components. One is the direct line of sight from where it's being sent to where it's being received. The other is reflected off the ground up to the other point, and then the other is the sky wave as it goes through. And so in some cases, the whoosh that you hear can be either interference from those three waves coming back together, or it can be, in some cases, that the refraction has moved to a slightly different layer, barely above the surface of the Earth, and it's causing that whooshing sound going through that way. So it's a lot like if you ever try to do anything with either rain scatter or meteor scatter, you'll get some of the same sounds out of that depending on what you're getting refracted and reflected and coming back to you. Okay? Great questions. So here is a diagram that sort of covers everything that we were just talking about. Here is the distance in ground wave. And you'll notice on this curvature, what this is showing is that ground wave is actually going past your visible horizon to a certain length past. And again, it depends on the weather, it depends on the ground that you're going over, how wet that ground is, what the temperature is of the air, what the water content is of the air. All of those things will have a play in that and can cause that to change from time to time, or sometimes it seems like immediately. This is referred to here as a skip zone, but this is the place that you're not able to cover. And then here is where sky waves start, and this is where it's refracted off the ionosphere. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. How many of you had the experience? I have, where I'm trying to work a DX station, I can hear him just as clear as a bell. And I try to send my signal to him, and sometimes all I will get back from him is W question mark, and then I will send it again, and I'll get to send it again, and I'll finally make a contact, but he is not hearing me nearly as well as I'm hearing him. And the reason for that is the takeoff angle of my antenna is probably different than the takeoff antenna of takeoff angle of his antenna. And so where I may be sending it to him here, he could be sending it to me here, or I could be sending it to me here, and it's coming short, so I'm picking up a weaker part of his signal than he's picking up from mine, or vice versa. And you'll find that happen all the time. And I know that I've had a conversation with Rich Fisher about this, and he had a ham that Rich got on, was working a DX station, and this other amateur, he called him and he said, "Have you worked him yet?" And he says, "No, I can't even hear him." And so Rich's response to him was, change antennas. And so if you change your antenna, you can change potentially your ability to pick up and work a DX station. So when it comes to especially the middle bands, and by middle bands I mean 20, 15, and 10 for me, because I've got a Yagi on my roof that works 40, and then the other 3. And then I've got a vertical antenna, and I've also got a wire antenna. Those are the ones that I primarily use and I switch between. And so depending on what the conditions are, I will sometimes have better luck with one antenna or another one to either work DX or, in some cases, to pass traffic, depending on what's going on. Because the other opportunity you've got on HF is working on NBIS or vertical signaling. You're basically, at that point, using the F layer of the ionosphere as a repeater. And it's just bouncing it straight back down to Earth. And so that's one of the other things that goes on. And I'll tell you, here's the other good thing about an end-fed antenna. If you want to be out working, and I know this is propagation. If you've got an end-fed antenna and you want to work NBIS out, run it out horizontally, short, just barely above the ground, 10 feet, and then run a ground wire right underneath it as a reflector, if you will. And that will generate a really nice vertical globe and give you a nice NBIS antenna that you can utilize for short-range communication, emergency communication, something like that, using the HF band. That's something that's kind of fun to play with. The other thing you can do with that is if you disconnect it and actually use a tuner on it, I can load that 80-meter antenna on 160 meters, and so it gives me the opportunity to run down in the 1 kilohertz range, now megahertz range. So this is how SCIP works. So basics: the sun influences radio communications beyond ground wave or line of sight. Conditions vary with time of day, season, latitude, and longitude. Reflection occurs at any boundary between materials with different dielectric constants. And for dielectric constants, we're talking about conductivity and permeability as it relates to that. So anytime you've got two layers that are different, whether it's in the ionosphere, someplace else, whether it's water, whether it's air, that is where you will get reflection. They can be reflected, as everybody knows, by buildings, trees, vehicles, groundwater, ionized layers in the atmosphere, air masses having different temperatures and moisture content. So one of the things that you can find sometimes, and if you're working contests, field day, good example, and you hear 20 meters working well during the day, and then as it gets dark, it goes away and 40 comes up. That's because of the dynamics of both the skywaves and ground waves, but primarily skywaves, of what's going to be your lowest usable frequency and your maximum usable frequency, and we'll talk about that again in a minute as well. Some radio energy is absorbed by the medium it passes through. Refraction is the bending of waves as it passes through one medium to another. And by one medium to another, that can be the ionosphere, it can be anything that is a different mass, different air masses. There's some other interesting things, and this is the if anybody has, there's something called the trans-equatorial F layer propagation for stations that are equidistant from the equator, and they're still trying to figure out exactly how that works, but it does work, and that's typically at VHF frequencies, where there is bending that goes on for that one. The amount of bending increases at higher frequencies, and the speed of the waves through the atmosphere change. The temperature and the air density levels, ionization, are different. Most HF bands depend on refraction. That's primarily what we're looking at. So, if I am communicating, which I have frequently with a small island or something over in the Indian Ocean, and you think about the globe, and you think about the angles that are going up and the bending that's coming back down, because typically a single bend skip is not going to be more than about 1,200 miles. And so in order to get to the other side of the Earth for communication, it's going up, refracting, coming down, bouncing off the Earth, going up, refracting again, coming back down. It does multiple paths in order to get around to the other side. And in some cases, when propagation is really, really good, and long path, which is going the opposite direction than the shortest distance you've got to the station that you're trying to communicate with, sometimes you'll actually hear an echo, and you'll hear your signal coming back from long path in your radio, and be able to pick that up, especially if you're operating full break-in, something for what's going on there. So don't let that scare you. It's not ghosts or anything. It's just propagation. Am I losing anybody yet? I hope not. And again, I'm not trying to make you experts on this, but I am going to encourage you to go out and start doing some more reading and some more studying on propagation, because it is a fascinating topic. Yes, sir?
So just a real quick question. You mentioned that echo.
Yeah.
The light is traveling, propagating very fast through the atmosphere, so that echo has to be very close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ideally it is, but if you look at the amount of time it takes for a signal to go around the Earth, sometimes it'll be a second or two.
So why is that? Because the propagation is slower in the atmosphere?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Greater distance.
So, this is just a slide that states the obvious. If it were not for refraction, radio waves would go out and never come back. But because they refract, they can come up and come back down. If you, one of the things that, and I don't know the answer to this, but it's a question that I talked with other hams about, which is, would you prefer to have a signal that was being refracted and coming down and hitting, at what angle would you like it to hit the Earth in order to get the most distance going forward? Because if it's coming down here and then it bounces back out here again and then coming back down, each one of those skips is a long ways to travel. And so would you prefer to have that or something that was coming up like this and taking more hops but giving you more coverage of the Earth as it goes around? And the refraction in the ionosphere is going to determine what that angle is. But when you're looking at conditions, sometimes I don't know which one I would actually prefer, because I would prefer fewer skips because I got less signal loss on that. But if I've got more skips, in other words, the refraction is steeper, I've got more coverage because I've got more places on the Earth that's covered. Have you got an opinion about that, Rich?
Well, it depends, and I was going to say that the ionosphere is not smooth.
Yeah.
So that has a lot to affect on the refraction of the signal too. I mean, people think that that's just a smooth place in our atmosphere, and it's all over the place. It goes up and down.
Mm-hmm.
So that can account for some fading.
I had to ask Rich a question because he's on the docket as one of the presenters today. At least he was for a while. Yeah.
I've done a lot of work in radar systems, and we've had a lot of experiences with atmospheric ducting.
Yes.
Are you going to discuss that at all?
No, I wasn't going to get into it because I wasn't going to deal with that. But the ducting is something, and especially at microwave levels and so forth, happens a lot. And the ducting, it basically provides, if you will, a channel that a radio wave can go into and operates within in order to bend it out to a receiving location. And so that ducting, like I said, I'm not going to make anybody an expert here, but as Mel says, that's one other thing that you can go do some research on. Because that happens a lot with microwave towers and alignment, and it also happens with radar frequencies, which are typically higher, depending on what the radar is looking for. A lot of surface radar is lower frequency, for example, and so forth. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that.
That's all right.
Did you have a question? No. Okay. So the ionosphere. It affects frequencies below 30 megahertz. It runs from 30 to 260 miles above the Earth's surface. Contains free ions and electrons. Ionization depends on ultraviolet radiation from the sun. We'll talk a little bit more about the sun impact here in a minute. The skip distances depends upon the frequency used at the time of day, the density of the ionosphere, and several layers which are several layers at varying distances at various heights. So when you take a look at the layers, the D layer is the closest one to the Earth, about 45 to 55 miles up. And to Rich's point, it does vary. Each one of these things varies and changes. And it's the one that absorbs RF signals and is a sponge during daylight hours. And this is what this takes the lowest usable frequency that you've got for long-distance HF communication. The E layer is 65 to 75 miles, effective refraction only during daylight hours. That's when it's ionized and it's the most ionized. And you will hear, and you'll probably see this even on a test if you're getting an upgrade, about sporadic E layer, and that works on some of the VHF frequencies and so forth, where you can get longer communications, at least for brief periods of time, because of that bending. The F layer is from 90 to 250 miles. During daylight, there are two layers, F1 and F2. F1 is not that important. F2 is the one that is the most important for communication. And you'll notice here it says F1 and F2 combine into one layer at night. So when you think about it, what that means is at night you have got a single F layer, and that night is always happening on the Earth someplace, at least for about 180 degrees of it. And then during the day, you've got two, F1 and F2. And so at some point in time, they are combining, and that line where they're combining is called the gray layer, the gray line. And that gray line is a great place if you're trying to work DX and you are on the same longitude as the station you're working. So, for example, down in the Arctic or tip of Africa or so forth, and you're far enough up east in the United States, you can leverage that gray line in order to get better propagation in order to reach that. And so the gray line is another concept, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail of that, but that's just one of the variables for propagation that you'll find interesting as you're doing your research and you're studying on that on your own. This is a graphic. I left this in here from another slide of where the D, E, F1, F2, and they combine. And again, they're combined at night. And this area here is the gray line. Oftentimes, if you're trying to reach a station, you can look at when the gray line is over their location, and at that point in time, oftentimes you'll have a better luck getting into them in order to make a contact. And again, it just depends on propagation and a lot of other things. But there's a lot of things to look at and think about, and that's why a lot of ham radio operators, especially those that are trying to work DX, find themselves up drinking coffee at very funny hours of the morning and late at night. And so that's just something that we do because we love it. I know that was going back to the story I told at the beginning where I used to watch the propagation change and be able to work the East Coast on my little 75-watt 40-meter rig when I had my novice class license. There were many times when my dad would be sticking his head into my shack saying, "Are you going to go to bed?" "Not yet, Dad." So again, types of propagation. This is going to be sort of a recap of some of the things we've talked about. Ionospheric waves, sky waves, the main portion of the radiation that leaves the antenna at angles above the horizon. Tropospheric waves, Mel, to your point, this is the radiation is kept close to the Earth's surface due to bending of the lower atmosphere. Higher HF or lower VHF, and that's the one where you're going to get that tropospheric ducting that Mel was questioning about. I would encourage you to go read about that. It's fascinating. Ground waves, surface waves, radiation directly affected by the Earth's surface, Earth-guided surface wave, vertically polarized, and absorption increases with frequency. Travels much further over water than over land. Again, going back to the Titanic and why that works so well. And the other piece that is important here, vertically polarized and absorption increases with frequency. Horizontal does not work well for ground waves.
Rick?
Yes?
Do you have anything about propagation on 630 meters with the D layer? How the D layer is affected?
I don't. I didn't cover that because I know a lot of people don't have radios that do that, but I'm glad you do because it is interesting. But I haven't got anything prepared to talk about that.
Okay, thanks.
Yes?
Is there a sweet spot in the
ground wave versus the sky wave matches what the Earth's ability to pull and bend the wave down?
There is a sweet spot that goes from non-existent to and it changes based on, again, time of day, all the other things, the conductivity, what you're going over, and so forth. So there is not a consistent sweet spot, and it changes over time. And that's one of the reasons. If you look at the communication that goes on a day in and day out basis. I check into the TWN net every night. I pick up traffic. Not every night, but most nights. And also during the day on voice. There are some days on voice where it's hard to hear anybody, and other times you're hearing everybody. And
a good way to actually see that in practice, if you ever check in or listen to the Utah Beehive at 12:30, you'll hear people sometimes coming in like they were right next door, and they're down in Arizona or Washington State. The next day, they're not there at all.
Yep. No, you're exactly right, and that's something that one of the things about propagation, which I find interesting, is to just experiment with it and see what's going on today versus another day. You've got there are times when and there are certain areas that, for my antenna configurations, I can contact anybody that I want to in Japan on just about any given day at any given time. They are always available. China, not quite so much, but more often. And then when I'm trying to contact somebody down in South Africa, as an example, that's a tough location for me to hit. When Eritrea was doing their de-expedition a few years back, I was trying to work them every darn day they were operating, and I could not get them. It was literally on the very last day they were operating, in the evening. Matter of fact, they're in my log at about 11:30 at night. For whatever reason, they opened up. I got them on sideband, on 20 meters, clear as a bell. Had no problem reaching them. That was the only time, that was the only opening of propagation to that location from my location, given my antenna configuration and what they were using on their side. And so it is variable, and that's the part that gets back to your sweet spot question. The sweet spot is whatever seems to be working on that particular day, and it changes. Now, solar cycles. This is the thing that's interesting, and this will get into the Carrington events and other things that go on. Sunspot cycle averages, you'll hear 11 years. 10.7 is the actual calculation for that. At solar maxima, the ionosphere is capable of refracting radio signals up to 40 megahertz or higher. At solar minimum, refraction is reduced and frequencies above 20 megahertz become unreliable. Now, we are currently in the upward slope, and technically we are actually at the peak and starting to come down to the other side of the sunspot cycle 25. 25 that we're in right now began in 2019, and it reached its peak in June of 2024 at, I was going to give you I was going to make out what date you but it was the sunspot count there was 171. Which is actually higher than the predicted solar max was going to be for that cycle. A new solar cycle is considered to have begun when sunspots group at higher latitudes, on the sun, and the magnetic polarities of the leading spots opposite that of the previous cycle. This is a fascinating dynamic because sunspots have got a magnetic orientation. And from one cycle to the next, that magnetic orientation changes. And so what you'll do is you'll see a sunspot cycle starts, when the sunspots group at higher latitude. So when the sunspots are at the top and bottom of the sun, that's where you're looking at a new cycle beginning. over the cycle, they peak and they move up towards the equator. And then when the next cycle starts, and then they will start to taper off as far as sunspots count is concerned. And then when the next cycle starts, those sunspots will start at, again, towards the higher and lower latitudes of the sun, and they will be polarized opposite direction again. And that's the cycle that goes on with the sun. Go read. It is fun. It is fascinating. And so I would just leave you with that, at least for that part of it. Here are the sunspot cycles going back to about 1900. This is where I got my license, right about there in that peak. And again, if you take a look at this most recent one, the sunspot cycle we were in before, 24, did not peak as high as people would have liked it to. This one actually peaked pretty high, as I said, about 171 is where the max count was. And it's starting its downward slide. So if you want to do HF and you want to work DX, do it now, because what will happen over time, and we'll talk about this also in a minute, is that when sunspot activity is high, 20, 15, and 10 are great. When sunspot activity is low, 40 and 80 are the ones that you're going to be able to get the distance on. And so that's just the way that works. And if you go out to space weather predictor, center, and so forth, you can find this information and a lot of good information on sunspot activity. I become a fan of space weather. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We're getting down here towards the end. But solar radiation, X-rays, ultraviolet, extremely ultraviolet. During solar flares, UV and X-ray emissions increase, and X-ray flares, C is the smallest, they letter them, medium size, X is the largest, in 1 to 8 angstrom range. And this is, I'm going to pull this slide out because you can't read it, but what this is attempting to summarize, and if you blow this thing up when it gets on the website, you can read how the various coronal injections and so forth will have an impact on different conditions. Solar flux is the basic indicator of solar radiation. It's the amount of solar noise or flux that's emitted, and it's at this specific frequency, 2800 megahertz, 10.7 centimeters. Solar flux units equates to a level of ionization in the F2 layer, and is a good indication of conditions for HF. Solar flux values from 50 to as high as 300. Low values indicate a low maximum usable frequency, and high values indicate good ionization to support long-distance communication at higher than normal frequencies. So, low values, 40 and 80. High values, 20, 15, 10. And 6 meters, if you want to go up there, but we're 6 meters is a different element all on its own. Sunspot numbers. You'll see this concept here of SSN, which is smooth sunspot numbers, reflect the level of support. It's calculated using 6 months of data before and 6 months of data after the desired month. So it's predicting, it's looking at backwards from that. And it varies from 0 to 200 with an average of 100. High SSNs are best for HF, and low SSNs are best for LF propagation. Solar indices. Again, coronal mass ejections, high particle emissions, protons and alpha particles cause higher absorption in polar regions. This is one of the things that you can leverage. If you think about working European stations and so forth, and if anybody's ever, you become an expert on global navigation when you do that, because if you want to get France, you're actually going to be pointing your antenna, if you've got a directional antenna, up about 38 degrees. You're going to be going north, up over the polar zones and back down. Well, these polar zones here cause higher absorption in the polar region, and you can't get through that. So when those happen, that messes up your ability to get communications over into Europe or into West Asia, West Asia, and so forth. The other ones are a little bit more effective, and if you're looking at trying to get to New Zealand or Australia, you're going to be shooting about 240 degrees. That's about the azimuth that you want your antenna to be pointed at in order to get to those locations. And those will not be affected by that polar ionization change. Again, low particulate emissions cause magnetic field disturbances, auroras, sporadic E, and again, sporadic E propagates 50 and 144 megahertz signals. So that will provide you the ability to get further in, for example, VHF ranges and so forth if you're using your handheld or your home station. Long-distance VHF communications for stations, equidistance. This is that transequatorial spread up that I was telling you about before. Here's the important part of this statement. It's hypothesized to be a result of intensified F2 layer during high sunspot activity. Signals have a rough aurora-like note. Hypothesized. They don't know exactly how this thing works yet. They're still doing research on it. And so it's something to just be aware of. And we're far enough north. I don't know if we're gonna be as effective with transequatorial F as somebody in Florida would be, perhaps, as an example.
What is your rough aurora-like note?
It's a consider it white noise placed over your radio signal, so it's got a scratchy sound to it. It's almost like you've got a bad FM station that you're trying to bring in. Rich, better description?
And then on 2 slides before this, you had something, a high and a low, I don't remember the words, but one, the low.
Lowest usable frequency and the highest usable frequency?
No. Can you go back just 2 slides real quick? So the high particle emission and low particle emission, is that referring to density of particles, the same particles?
Count.
Count?
Yeah.
So, but they're both protons and alpha particles?
Yeah, it's really the amount of the ejection that's going on or being produced versus the density of it. Because, for example, when I was mentioning the Carrington event before, that was actually visible from Earth, but it didn't cause problems for 2 days because it took 48 hours for that to come to the Earth to cause problems. And so that was both magnitude and of the ejection, but it's really the particle count that caused that more than anything else. And that's what you'll see when you get that high particle count that's coming up. That's what makes the aurora happen. And when you've got those coronal mass ejections, that's when you can sometimes see the aurora as far south as we are.
So it's the high particle count that causes.
Yes.
Okay, so that was one of my questions. You have low particle emissions cause disturbances, auroras, and sporadic. So it's
right. It's just the amount of the impact that it has on the ionosphere layer is what they're talking about with that. Because when the sunspot counts goes up, you're getting more ionization of primarily the F2 layer. And that's what makes it more effective for communications on 2015 10 meters. And when the sunspot goes low, ionization is not as much. So the highest usable frequency drops down, and that's where it gets in the 40 and 80 meter side for that refraction to come back down.
Thank you.
I think we're done with that one. Yes. So these indexes, if you get on the high noon net, they always report this activity on a daily basis. But these are the other indexes that you'll see of natural variations, electronic fields. K-index is a quasi-logarithmic scale of 3-hourly range of magnetic activity relative to an assumed quiet day, assumed being an operative word there, for a single geometric observatory site. Then the A-index is a daily average of the K-index values. Generally an A-index at or below 15 and a K-index at or below 3 are best for propagation. So when you see those numbers go up, you'll find, as Mel was pointing out earlier, it'll be harder to hear all those stations on the beehive net, and when those are low, it will be easier for you to do. This is just showing you the way they count those and what constitutes quiet and very major storm when it gets up that big. So quickly, HF band prediction. 80 and 40 meters, good bands for distance communication during sunspot minimum. 30 meters allows greater distance than 40 meters at night. 20 meters, most popular long haul at all phases of sunspot cycle, but closes down at nighttime during winter and sunspot minimum. And 15 meters during sunspot minimum, few stations are heard. Boy, is that the truth. 10 meters with low absorption allows good communication with relatively low power during daytime. And that's also where 6 meters kicks in for the same reason. So that sort of gives you a general sense of when bands are good to use. And this is something, if you look at the notes for de-expeditions, they will plan what frequencies they are using based on where they're trying to hit, who they're trying to work within the world, whether it's European stations, North American stations, South American, or whatever. And they will pick their frequency ranges based on those propagation predictions for where they are and then where their target is going through that process. And that, just reading de-expedition notes, is a great learning experience for coming up with frequencies that you want to use and what antennas you may want to put up. So, here's the information. ARL has got a great propagation reporting tool. NOAA has one, QRZ Solar Report, which you can get at QRZ.com. Here are some others. The Carrington event that I mentioned, if you just Google that, you'll find this. This is actually a good write-up on Wikipedia about that, about how that happened and when it happened. Now,
if we had an equivalent Carrington event today, would it take out every bit of communications we have in the world?
Every bit is a tough reach because you've got two sides of the Earth. Yeah. And so it depends on when it hits and where it hits and who's facing it when it finally gets there. And it will arrive. It doesn't arrive for a second and you're done. It arrives over time. And so as the Earth is turning, you're going to get multiple things. It would take out a lot. You would be very busy with the intertime. I will just say that. If we had a Carrington event today, because it will have an impact on that kind of an infrastructure. And that's why it's a good idea to keep at least one radio. I do. And it's a VHF, UHF radio in a Faraday cage so that something like that will not at least take everything out. So I've actually keep my Go box when I can in a Faraday cage that I've got at home. So that's what I do.
Can you make this available on our website, this presentation?
Absolutely. I was going to give you a really smart aleck answer, but I won't. I'll get that to whoever I need to, and it'll be made available. So with that, yes, sir.
You talk about sudden ionospheric disturbances. People like he and I listen, but if you have a Navy transmitter in Washington at 19 kilohertz, millions of watts, and they communicate with submarines. You can put a receiver on that frequency, and the sun, if it has a sudden ionospheric disturbance, will show that on your display. Yep. So it's an interesting...
It really is fascinating because, and in submarine communication, it's fascinating because they use low frequency and that, when you look at some of the antennas that they trail out of the submarines when they're actually trying to pick up some of those signals, it's amazing. They're huge. And so that the low frequencies that they use for that communication is an interesting piece. I haven't done as much reading about that as some of the others, but I am familiar with that, and you're exactly right. The sudden ionic disturbances, they happen all the time. And you can watch them if you're monitoring and see them on scopes or hear them, quite frankly. Yeah.
Another question: when you were on listening, and at night 40 meters opens up, and we can get Southern California, but the noise level increases, and you have to have a better receiver to pull out some of those signals.
Yes.
And I've noticed that when I lived back east, Europe would come in at night, and the noise level would get so high that it was hard to, have a little Heathkit 3-watt receiver try to receive some of those signals.
Nope, you're exactly right. And I'll tell you one of the things that's interesting about that is when you go out a long way, way away from people, that noise does not kick up the same. And so a lot of that noise is coming from the infrastructure around you when people are turning on lights, stoves, especially this day and age. Their televisions that could be causing you problems. The LED lights and a lot of other things generate noise, and that's one of the things that generates the noise, at least at my station, that I figured out at night that causes problems. And so that's one of the reasons it's fun to go out in the desert in the middle of nowhere and do communications, because you won't get that same noise at night, but you'll get they'll open up, because I'll get it. I'll sometimes, even during the day, but at night, I can be running an S7 or an S9 noise level at my station, depending on what's going on around me. And there is somebody during the Beehive Net that has got a car. When they turn it on, I can hear the darn ignition run. It's clear as a bell. and so I've got to figure out whose car that is, and I've got to go spike the tires. So, but fortunately, they only started up for a while and then they leave and go away, and it doesn't become a problem. But no, that's a great observation. You're exactly right.
And how about sunrise and sunset termination? When the sun rises, is that gray line?
That's a gray line. Yeah, because the ionization is different, because one of the things that you're looking at there is, as it says, and it's really dealing with the way the F1 and the F2 layer are combining, and the ionization changes at that juncture between. So if you're looking at the F1 and F2 layer, you've got F1 and F2 coming by, and at sunset it combines to just the F layer, okay, going around, and it's at that juncture where you've got where those are coming together. That's what increases the ionization to make it more effective for HF communication on that gray line path to be able to do that.
That's a north-south path.
That's a north-south path. Yes, it is. Yep. So it doesn't do you well east-west, but if you're going north-south, and the gray line is not like a millimeter wide. There's a distance there for it, so you can use that. That's what helps me work South America, because South America is a tough one for me to hit during the day, especially. But it gives me the ability to hit that more effectively when gray line is happening. So early in the morning, or late at night or in the evening when it's just coming through.
How far each side of sunrise or sunset, minute-wise, is it?
I don't have a number for that.
Like
I will tell you that in my experience, if I can, there's about a 2-hour window, obviously, between us and the East Coast, and usually if gray line is right between us going through the central time zone, I can be effective on gray line both to my time zone and to the East Coast time zone, getting down south. And that's about as broad as I have noticed it for me personally at my station. And so it's about a 2-hour width of technically that would be a 3-hour width of time zone to be able to be effective utilizing the gray line. Any experiences different than that, Rich?
No, it's a life experience.
I'm giving you every chance to help me present. Believe me.
These last few days that 10 meters been going during the day, and when it starts getting dark, it goes away.
It does. 10 meters is another one that falls in that same category. It's a lot like 20 in that, but you're right. It works real during the day, and at nighttime it goes quiet. Okay. Yes, sir.
I go camping in Bear Lake a lot, and I take my rig with me. Mm-hmm. And I think Bear Lake, I'll be north of it, up into the Idaho section, but I think the lake must help my radiation. I've worked in Russia and Italy and all those stations. It's amazing. I can't do it at home.
It does, and as a matter of fact, I was listening. There were some people that I used to listen to often when I was, if I was trying to work DX that was going on, and they were actually located in Northern California and Oregon and Washington State, but they were right on the coast. And so what they would typically be running from those stations was long path, because they were shooting right over the Pacific Ocean in order to get things started. And so the reflection coming down into the water would go up and it would work very effectively for them. Didn't help me at all because I'm too landbound. But it was interesting listening to them, and sometimes I'd try to piggyback on some of their contacts to see if I could work them as well. Short path, but it wasn't, that happens sometimes not so much. Yeah?
A lot of people like to go operate out of Antelope Island because operating off the Great Salt Lake gives you great trouble.
It is. Matter of fact, I will be there along with Rich and at least one other ham on this next weekend to do Winter Field Day. So that'll be fun. Okay. Any other questions? Was this helpful? Did I lose anybody? If I got at least a handful of people that want to go do some more research on propagation and study antenna propagation patterns and do modeling and all that other good stuff. If I have, I feel like I really have. So, with that, I will turn it back over to you, Craig.
We got one more question.
Yes, sir.
I'm dumb as rocks on some of this, and very fascinating. But how is the Great Salt Lake making a significant impact on propagation when it seems like it's only like one bounce or whatever, and then you're still going over land? So what I would expect over the ocean, you'd have an effect for a long ways.
It does over the ocean. What's really good about the Great Salt Lake is that it doesn't. There's two things about the Great Salt Lake that are handy. One is that for the initial departure of your signal, it helps pitch your takeoff angle lower. I guess that's the best way I would say that, because that low lobe on your antenna is able to hit that water, bounce up with very little signal loss, and so that first skip is a stronger signal than when it comes down. Because you're right, once it leaves and gets over the Great Salt Lake, you've lost the benefit of it. But it keeps your signal stronger, longer, going over saltwater than going over a mountain. And that's the difference between those two. Yes, sir.
KSL's transmitter, the 50,000 watt, is that on the salt flats?
Yes.
Just for that purpose?
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
It's a good ground.
It is a great ground point. And that's the other piece of that goes on with that. Well said. Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for letting me come and talk to you.
Thank you, Rick. For me, one of the most interesting comments came from Rich, who didn't know he was presenting, but he helped. And that was, I've got this problem where I'm communicating halfway. The answer was, use a different antenna. When I was new, I thought, I was trying to do the ham radio by cell phone approach. I'm going to grab my radio, it'll do everything I want, it'll get me anywhere I want. I found out in a hurry that just isn't the way it works. And having multiple antennas, having different kinds of radios for different things, really does make a difference. And that's one of the reasons I got 10 grand tied up in this, and I'm sure some of you have more than that. But I'm a very patient wife. We're still together somehow, even though she thinks that my roof looks like a porcupine, and I'm preparing for an alien abduction. But there we go. Thank you again so much, and we appreciate everybody being together. Next month is our show and tell right here in this room. Bring what you've been doing and show us what's interesting in your life.
22 February is the Digital Communications Conference in Salt Lake, and the Utah VHF Society will have our swap meet, not in February, but the last weekend of March, the 29th.
Okay. It sounds like we may have a conflict there, but we'll be here doing show and tells.
We'll deal with it.
All righty. Any other business that we need to bring before the body of the club? Let's go enjoy the snow. Thank you, everybody.